Well, welcome everybody, and welcome to our seminar. It's a CEPR, IBF and SAFE joint seminar today on the COVID debt pandemic, historical lessons and challenges ahead. Well, there's a looming sovereign debt crisis in developing countries, emerging economies, and what are we going to do about it? Well, we've been here before, so it shouldn't be a problem, should it? Well, probably not quite that easy. Here to discuss what we're going to do about it, we have three people today. First of all, Jan Peter Kranen from SAFE, Goethe University. Jan, welcome back.
Hi, Tim. Hi, everybody.
And from the Kiel Institute for the World Economy, Christoph Trebesch. Christoph, hello.
Hello, everybody.
And finally, from the Graduate Institute Geneva, Ugo Panizza. Ugo, hello.
Hi, Tim.
And I should point out everybody's CEPR affiliations. Good to have you all on board with us. Now, there's plenty of you here today, so what's going to happen? First of all, I'm going to hand over to Jan in a minute, and he's going to start by introducing our seminar. He's also going to introduce our two main speakers. Christoph then is going to talk about some of the historical lessons, how we can apply them. Ugo is going to follow up by examine the particular challenge that we have at the moment. It's a webinar, so we really want you to take part, and you can do that by asking questions. Use the little QA button at the bottom. Type in your question. You can do it any time. You don't have to wait until until after everyone's presented. In fact, it's better if you get them in early. And one of the reasons is because when you go to that QA tab, you can see other people's questions. And you can upvote any that you think are particularly good, and the ones that are upvoted the most, well, we get to them first. So we will be here for an hour today, provided you got the questions for it. You always do. Your questions are always great. So I will hand over to Jan to introduce the session. Jan.
Tim, thank you very much for doing the introduction and for running the whole show. I'm very happy to give an introduction to a topic, the COVID debt pandemic, historical lessons and challenges ahead, which I think is very, very timely, of course. And I want to build in the introduction a bit of a bridge between the current issues we are facing and let's say, the tapping into history to find some examples and some parallels, which we will later on hear when Christoph and Ugo will be speaking. This is a joint event, as you said, with the Institute for Banking and Financial History at Goethe University and SAFE and CEPR. And it's basically that small institute that has always been eagerly bringing together economics and historians and keeping that topic up when it was not so hyped as it is, of course, nowadays. Let me start with this one. COVID pandemic is really a historical event, and it will remain so, and we will probably read about it and talk about it for a long time to come. Why is it an historical event, in my opinion? Well, first of all, it is a concurrent shock to production, consumption, and income in very many countries across the world. So GDP 2020 estimates by the World Economic Outlook by the IMF of October, very recent, is about the EU -7%, US -4%, India -10%, South Africa -8%. It's a significant drop in GDP, and 21 may be even worse in some of these countries. Second, this concurrent shock has stimulated an enormous fiscal response, national response, that is said. In India, 6% of GDP, South Africa 8%, US 14%, Germany 38%. So there's quite, as in the GDP effect, quite a cross-sectional variation. And this variation, of course, is very likely running the risk of widening the GDP gaps or GDP growth gaps that exist between all these countries and these regions already, and which in some cases, like in Europe, have produced or been responsible for a lot of tensions among these countries. So we see problems arising. Moreover, in the European Union, at least, there has been a surprisingly large common effort to complement the national program. So this EU recovery program of about 750 billion, which has just been agreed upon very, very recently, is in a way complementary, that it narrows the gap again. So it works in the opposite direction. It delivers something like a common good to Europe, which it didn't have before. And on top of that, we have the European Central Bank and other central banks in the world, which have put up a vast amount of almost unlimited liquidity for the banking sector, and has helped to maintain, so to speak, the lending business. So this is that are the facts. What's remarkable about it? First of all, we are facing a systemic shock. For a long time, since the financial crisis at least, we have been thinking about what could be the next systemic shock that we might see. But I think not many have thought about a pandemic. So here it is. Second, we have a speedy fiscal and political response, and very sizable. And finally, we have at least partly been able to deal with the common pool or the mutualization problem that goes along with, at least on the European side, with the recovery program. So these are all interesting and largely positive aspects. There are, however, side effects which are possible and which may be accompanied by these measures that I just described. First of all, we may end up with over-indebted firms. We may end up with over-indebted states. And the question of sustainability of that process arises almost naturally. This turns the light, or that turns the attention to the microeconomic questions of choice of instrument. What instruments are we going to use? So we have discussed almost in this series here whether debt or equity are the right instruments to use. But there are other questions. Should the responses be monetary or should they be fiscal? Should we forbear the loss realization at the firm level, or should we restructure early on? And lastly, should we do any efforts in the banking sector on or off balance sheet? So whether or not any of these instruments is the appropriate one, in the end depends on the subsequent path of the pandemic. So how does it all go on from now? Is the second wave that we currently experience here in Europe, is this the last one, or just one further in a longer list of such waves? We actually, if we ask our experts, we really don't know. There is real ambiguity in the world. And that is the reason why economists have started no longer to talk about expected values, about mean growth rates or growth forecasts, but rather about scenario analysis. We distinguish different paths that were possible and then talk about instruments, appropriate policy measures along these paths, these scenarios. I think that this is different from what we did earlier, and it brings really in an instrument that we are currently using today, that is learning from examples, from historical examples that at other places, at other times may have played a role. And I think the impulse in economics to go for scenarios and the inviting of people who work on historical episodes in which crisis played a role is very short way from one to the other. So in that respect, I'm very glad to have two persons whom I may introduce now, namely Christoph Trebesch from the Institute for Weltwirtschaft for World Economy in Kiel, which is incidentally a sister institution of SAFE within the Leibniz Association, who has been working for a long time on debt markets and over indebtedness. And so we are I'm very happy to have you here today, and I'm looking forward to what you have to say on our overall topic, the pandemic, the debt pandemic, so to speak. And Ugo Panizza, secondly, the professor of international economics at the Graduate Institute Geneva, who has been working for a long period on finance and development, after appointments, I have to add, at international institutions, development institutions. So he brings two sides of experiences, academic and non-academic. And I forgot to mention that Christopher is, of course, also a professor at the University of Kiel. So that is basically the background, and I hand over back to Tim. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jan. And I'm very pleased to have Christoph and Ugo today with us today, because I've spoken to both of them about similar topics a couple of times for Vox Talks this year, and on all times it's been terrific. So I guarantee a good experience today. To start that off, I note that we have historical lessons and challenges ahead. We're leaning more towards the historical lessons side of the ledger. We have Christoph. So Christoph, it's your turn to speak.
Wonderful. Let me share the screen here. Okay. Hope that works. So yes, thanks so much for the kind introduction. And let me start off right from what Jan said, and that we have much to learn from history. In fact, I think the current crisis in developing country triggered by the COVID pandemic has to and should be seen in a long history of episodes of debt distress and debt crisis. And I think there's much to learn both on how to resolve this crisis and to understand what is currently going on when looking back at these earlier episodes. So let me, the way I framed this is basically historical lessons, but with a focus on the risks, right? A bit also on the challenges ahead. So let me frame this, the current challenges, the risks, in three ways. All right, three main points. The first main risk I see for developing countries in the current situation is that things may turn out nastier than we think at the moment. As Jan has said, there's a lot of uncertainty at the moment. It's unclear how the second wave will play out. And this situation mimics, the start of earlier crises. Some tapered out without drama, but some of these crises, notably in the 1980s and in the 1930s and 20s, led to basically lost decades, 10 years of stagnation for countries that had a high debt burden to carry and that needed to resolve the debt crisis situation. So let me point kind of the worst case scenario for the developing world is that a dozen or even several dozen countries may end up in a similar situation. The lesson from history is that case-by-case restructuring, case-by-case crisis solution can be quite messy and quite protracted. And several of these crises started out similarly. The global shock, then there was a perception this was a liquidity crisis, but it turned out that this was in fact a solvency crisis, a long dragged out process. So let me give a few insights on that. The second risk that I see is creditor free riding. Over the past decades, we have seen private creditors systematically getting a better deal than other credits, and particularly official credits. So basically, governments suffered, when they lent to other governments, suffered a higher likelihood of default, higher arrears, so late payments, and higher haircuts compared to private creditors. So private creditors have been getting a better deal. They have been treated more favorably than the official sector. And this trend, this historical trend, is being confirmed at the moment, with China playing an ambiguous role in this setting. And the third risk is legal. So we've seen a kind of major shift in sovereign debt markets over the past 20 to 30 years, in that the risk of creditor litigation has become real, especially the case of Argentina looms large, which had this 10-year dispute with creditors and ultimately had to concede and pay out huge settlement payments in 2015 and 16. So this risk of these litigation threats have become a new normal, and this is one of the reasons why private creditors have gained bargaining power, and that can partly explain what is going on at the moment. So let me turn to risk number one. Debt crisis can be very protracted, and let me give you two examples of kind of the worst case scenarios. I'm not saying that we're ahead of such a scenario, but there are certainly real risks, tail risks at least, that we might end up in another lost decade. the liquidity conditions, the global liquidity conditions, of course, are much more favorable today than in the past. And yet, we have seen situations that have turned out badly. And I'd rather be on the cautious and warning sign than overly optimistic in this. Being a sovereign debt research, I guess, makes you that way. So let's look at two lost decades. The first is the 1920s and 1930s. And this was a debt overhang episode triggered by war lending. So this is official lending. Governments, especially the United States, lending to European countries in the war, both during the war and for reconstruction afterwards. And countries, these borrowing countries had piled up huge amounts of debt in the course of World War I. And these debts were basically very hard to repay given the post-war situation. And the way the international system reacted was basically similar to today, basically cash flow relief. So there were the debt payments were suspended, there were reschedulings, and it took pretty much 1 decade until the Hoover moratorium, which was a similar to the DSSI, if you want, a suspension on debt payments to other governments. Okay, and that yet until only 3 years later, with the de facto default of the United Kingdom, France, Italy, and other countries towards the United States, that the debt stock was effectively written off and this crisis got resolved. And this was like more than 10 years of continuing headline news. If you look at the New York Times during this era, it's really, debt problems loomed large, that there were these international meetings, international conferences to solve the crisis. So this was one example of how these things can drag out for a long time. Similar to the last decade of the 1990s, which more people might know well. So after the bank lending boom of the 1970s to developing countries, there were a series of defaults in the early 80s following the large interest rate increase and oil shock. And the way the international system reacted was arranging case by case reschedulings, rollovers, debt payment suspension. Again, similar to today. It took until 1986 to have a more systemic approach with the Baker Plan, which ultimately did not succeed. So this was again cash flow relief, no real debt stock reduction, and only with the Brady Plan there was actual face value debt relief. And so it took for some of these countries until the mid-1990s to exit the debt crisis situation. So yet another episode of a lost decade with messy crisis resolution. This is a deeper dive into this lost decade. So this shows you a combination of information on default, which are the blue lines here. So these are spells in which the countries were in a default, and the red dots combining that are restructuring events, right? So what this graph shows you is in the early 1980s, many countries went into default, and then came a period of ongoing restructuring and rescheduling efforts. Right, some countries had 8 restructurings in a row, serial restructurings, and to finally exit the debt crisis overhang and cure this default, which only happened with the Brady deal effectively. So, just because today we think, we should be wary of not repeating that. That's essentially where I want to go. We should be wary that there is the risk that we step into this process of serial restructuring. With too little haircuts, just cash flow relief, and basically kick down the can down the road. Okay, so there's a real risk of that. The second risk I'd like to emphasize, besides this lost decade danger, is free riding. This is a plot from a paper with Matthias Schlegel and Mark Wright, where we really run comparisons, how are creditors treated by sovereigns in default. Okay. So, given that there's no international insolvency procedure, governments can pretty much decide ad hoc who they service first and who they default upon. And then they can also negotiate what kind of haircuts they impose on one creditor versus the other. And the paper basically concludes that the official creditors, bilateral government-to-government loans, are treated less favorably than the private creditors. And this can be seen, this is just one, we have several ways to measure that, but this is one graph. So this is the haircut, the loss suffered by the creditors for official debt, right? With a median of above 60% if we use market discount rates, compared to only about 40% for bank and bondholders. Okay, so private creditors in that sense got a better deal. And we are seeing a repetition of that trend now. The DSSI is only targeted to official creditors. Private creditors were kindly asked to participate but decided to abstain. So they are not part of the current debt relief efforts. And it's likely that if and hopefully when we start restructuring more bonds and private instruments, they will also get a more favorable haircut, lower losses in the wake of this crisis. So there's a real trend towards creditor discrimination in favor of privates. And this trend might also apply to a new player, which is China. China is now the biggest the biggest creditor to developing countries when it comes to bilateral official lending, so state-driven lending. In fact, this graph from a paper with Sebastian Horn and Carmen Reinhardt shows you that debt to China is now exceeding the entire portfolio of all other Paris Club members, so all other OECD governments, think of it that way, and the entire portfolio of the World Bank as of 2017. So China has become a major lender to developing countries, and this is just the global plot on this, showing you that some countries owe more than 10% of the GDP in debt to China. So China is really a central player, as many of you know, in this game, and there are signs. The role of China is a bit ambiguous. There are positive signs. They participated in the DSSI, but there are also signs that China is trying to avoid deep haircuts or trying to avoid participating in the same way as other bilateral governments might be willing to. But again, the jury is still out, but there's at least signs that China is seeking seniority akin to the private creditors in the past decades. The third risk I'd like to emphasize is legal, as I said. Bottom line, this graph is in work with Julian Schumacher and Henrik Anderlein, and what we see is that the number of cases and the amounts litigated has increased substantially over the past decades. This is of course driven by individual large cases here, but if you look at it another way, we find that about 50% of sovereign defaults are now accompanied by litigation. And this litigation is also becoming more disruptive, creditors becoming more aggressive. And that, of course, there's basically the threat that you may end up like Argentina, okay? You don't want to see a 10-year de facto financial autarky. So these specialized creditors who sue sovereigns, they use a variety of tactics to essentially disrupt the international financial trade and goods trade of countries in default. That is a major risk, of course, for these countries, and that's why there's basically a shift in bargaining power in favor of private creditors in all these negotiations, and that should be kept in mind. So there was already a trend towards better treatment of the creditors, and this trend might be even reinforced post-Argentina, with creditors having a important card in the hand, and that is the threat of litigation. So let me conclude. Three maybe opening remarks for the discussion. History warns us that it might not be a good idea to hope for too long for a good outcome and engage in these cash flow relief schemes again and again and push down the can down the road. So don't wait too long with deep restructurings. The risks of doing too much, right? I mean, restructuring is not a free lunch. There are costs. Country might be excluded from capital markets. That might be spillovers. But the risks overall, viewed from a global perspective, the risk of doing too little are larger than the risk of doing too much. That might take away from the long run perspective. We should avoid this lost decade at all costs, and we should avoid the serial restructuring schemes we have seen in the past. We should also think about ways to limit the ability of private creditors to free ride and litigate, and the various options. I don't have time to go into them, or you can go into them later. And then get China involved, which is of course a big challenge, but there I think transparency is key. Public debt should be a publicly available data. Okay, so public debt should be transparent. Every citizen should know who the government owes money to, at what terms, under which contract. So there's no reason to be so intransparent that does not just apply to China, but to all international creditors. So I think a big transparency push is a very important element in resolving this situation. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Christoph. And yeah, I'm pretty sure that we'll get into how we compel private investors to get involved. I'm sure Ugo's got some point of view about that later on. Martin, I know your question. We're going to leave that because again, I think that's going to overlap with what Ugo has to say. Well, let's find out what Ugo has to say, actually, rather than me predicting it. Ugo, you're on.
Thank you. So that one way by Christoph was a wonderful kind of introduction of a few things that I want to say. So let me see if I can share my screen. It should be this one. You have it? We have it. Okay, fantastic. So I thought to call it Life and Death After COVID-19. And what I was thinking to do is to spend a few minutes talking about how was the situation before COVID, that situation, and then how it changed, and what are the perspectives for the future, which will link to a few of the things that Christoph said. So this is the IMF in February released a report in which sort of summarized a bunch of debt sustainability analysis conducted up to November 2019. So this was before COVID. And the IMF and the World Bank classify countries into green light, these are no problem country, yellow light, some problem, red light, or gray, these are countries which either are at high risk of debt distress, the red one, or already in default, the gray country. So if you look around 2013, about less than 1/4 of low-income countries were either in default or at high risk of default. Already in 2019, we had half of the low-income countries at high risk. So this was before COVID. Then, as Jan said, we had this massive hit on the world economy. This is again something that Jan said. So here on the vertical axis, you have the GDP growth forecast for 2020 done before COVID, done in October 2019. And if I put the June 2020, I would get similar thing if I put the October 2020. And it's just a line that says if you're on the line, the forecasts are as good as the one year before. You see they're all below the line. So massive downgrade in GDP growth. Pick one country, India. It was expected to grow at 5.6%. Now it's expected to contract by 5.5%. So 11% contraction in expected GDP. And there are only 7 countries for which the fund expect to have positive growth in 2020. After the 2008 crisis, there were 79 countries with positive growth. So this is like a massive, massive shock. So here it is. And if you look at forecast on the debt to GDP ratio, these are just, again, the orange bars. These were the forecast done in October 2019 by the IMF, and the blue bars were the forecast done in October 2020. So you see a big increase in expected debt to GDP everywhere in the world. So the situation got worse. This is not a big surprise, but I wanted to sort of give you a quantification of this feeling. And then we have this dilemma, which I think was put extremely well by the Prime Minister of Ethiopia in an op-ed in the New York Times, that at some point we're facing this dilemma. Some countries are facing this dilemma. Do you take care of your own people, or you pay your debt? And a way to see this, there is this graph which I took from Standard & Poor's. So you have countries which are paying, more than 50% of their government revenues in that service. So that tells you this trade-off for these countries is real. So the G20 acted on this. So one big initiative, which was mentioned by Christoph, was the debt service suspension initiative, which I forgot an I here, so it's TSSI, not the SSS, which was launched, where in April it was implemented on May 1st, 2020. Originally was supposed to end at the end of this year, but now it has been extended until June 2021, and the G20 said that probably in April it will extend it even more. So as Christoph said, the initiative said there should be debt suspension for the service owed to bilateral Paris Club creditors, to all the listed countries who ask for it. And it is also included a sentence saying, we call on private creditors to participate. And as Christoph said, the private creditors said, no, thank you. So there was no participation there. Another important initiative taken by the G20 was the launch of the common framework for debt restructuring. I will say something more in a minute, but the idea is try to address some of the problems were highlighted by Christoph. Christoph mentioned the Paris Club. Paris Club is a club of basically advanced economies which renegotiate together their bilateral debt. Now we have some new players. China is one of them, but it's not the only new one, who are not part of the Paris Club. And the idea of the common framework is to create a system in which all these official players will grant debt relief with similar conditions, hopefully, and I will say something more about this, limiting this free riding problem, which was mentioned by Christoph. And as you will say there are different views on this. So that's where we stand now. Now, you can think that there are two views on what's going on next. And I think about this view about thinking two masterpieces of French literature. One is Candid by Voltaire, who has this figure of Dr. Pangloss, who is this very optimistic guy that says things are the best way that they possible be. And the other one is Molière, where there is this imaginary invalid, which is things to have all the sort of disease in the world. So one is the optimistic view, the other one the pessimistic view. So let me say something about the optimistic view, which is somehow the view, I call this the view from Wall Street and 19th Street, because it seems to be shared both by the finance industry and also by some of our friends at the fund and at the IMF, which are around 19th and H Street in Washington, D.C. And if you talk with them, they say that the SSI was very useful. The common framework is an important advance because it will solve some of this free riding problem. And then markets are incredibly calm. So there was a sudden stop in around March, but capital flow restarted immediately. Interest rates are incredibly low. And unless something strange happens in the advanced economies, there will not be a generalized crisis. According to this view, there will be a few defaults down the road, but nothing disruptive, nothing comparable to the crisis of the 1980s that Christoph described. And according to this more optimistic view, we'll be able to deal with these issues with the instruments we have. This graph, which I stole from our friend and co-author, is a joint co-author of myself and Christoph, Jeremy Zettelmeier, show a little bit what has happened. So here around March, we had this massive increase in spread. This was the sudden stop, but they went down really fast. There has been up to half of the year, massive amount of flows to emerging market countries. There are still several countries here, countries which don't have access to the capital market. So the number of countries without access jumped at the time of the crisis, but then it went down. And then if you just want to have an example of this thing, it's Peru. Peru in 1 week had 3 presidents, so sort of competing with Argentina around 2001. And they issued a 100 years bond with a coupon of 3.5%. So this is, if this is not optimistic, what can you say more? So the view from my window, and from what Christoph said, maybe also from his window in Hamburg, is a bit more pessimistic, might be a bit closer to Argan, the character from Molière. as I mentioned before, the private sector did not participate in the DSSI, and relief provided by the DSSI was relatively small. I have a paper with Patrick Bolton, Lee Buchheit, Beatrice Vedder, Olivier Gourinchas, and Chang Tai-she, and Mitu Gulati, in which we had a proposal to facilitate the involvement of the private sector, but it didn't go anywhere. The other more pessimistic view is that the common framework will not solve problems related to private sector participation, and also problems related, so Christoph has mentioned China's lending. A lot of China's lending is not lending done by Chinese government per se, but it's Chinese lending done by, banks or, institutions that look like private, but they're 100% state-owned. And if the private sector doesn't go in, these guys are not gonna go in either. And the third problem is that markets are fickle. So I'm almost at the last slide. Oh, this is just to show you, this was the debt service due by middle-income countries. This was the debt service due by lower middle-income countries. This was the debt service targeted by the G20 Initiatives. So here you have more than 200 billion. Here was 14 billion. Actually, not all countries applied. So the debt service relief that was delivered was about 5 billion, if I remember correctly, which is a lot of money. I wish I had a fraction of that, but it's not much compared to this type of values. And then favorable conditions are fragile. This is a graph from the Financial Times that shows that things are good because you have a massive amount of debt, which was partly mentioned by Jan, issued by advanced economies, which pay negative interest rates. So just today I heard that Germany is earning money by issuing debt at a negative interest rate. And same thing for Switzerland, which has a yield curve with negative rate up to 30 years. So maybe that's why Peru can issue 3.5%, because 3.5% looks like a good deal. But I want to remind you that moods change rapidly. So I mentioned that Peru issued a 100-year bond at a very low interest rate recently. Argentina did so 3 years ago, and things did change rapidly. So hope for the best, prepare for the worst. So have a paper with Patrick Bolton and Mitu Gulati, which put forward some suggestion how we could deal if bad thing happens. And just to be pessimistic, let me conclude with the fact that Molière, which was also acted in his own tragedies, actually died while acting as pretending to be imaginary invalid. But I'll stop here. So this is some of the background material. Let me stop my sharing if I do it. I don't know how to do it though.
You should. There we go. Yes. Thanks very much, Hugo. That's a kind of downbeat ending about Molière. I didn't know about that. But then again, I was I had to go sort of scrambling for my reference. But I say my reference book's Wikipedia after you did promise Molière this morning in this. It's not normally what we get. So very terrific. Thank you very much for both of those presentations. We've got some questions in. I'm hoping for some more, but I really want to get to the first question, the one that Martin asked very early on, and it really is the meat and potatoes of this whole thing, really, isn't it? And and his question, and especially if I read it, given this finding on the inequality of treatment between Paris Club and private, do you view a sovereign debt restructuring mechanism type or other legal instruments such as a UN resolution as desirable or realistic as a way to resolve this? Who wants to take it first? Ugo, do you go first and then Christoph?
Actually, let Christoph go on this.
Let Christoph go
he knows
first.
more on this.
Oh, good.
So my take would probably be desirable, yes. Realistic, not too much. But so I think full-fledged SDRM is hard to see with the US and the UK and other. It depends. I mean, never say never, but I guess what is more realistic are small steps, and these small steps. So there's I think there are two parts to my answer. The first is private versus official creditors. I think a central point is really to limit disruptive litigation. Right. This is what seems important, and one way to go about this is to change the domestic legislation. Right, so laws in Britain, Belgium, New York, France, etc., could be changed to, and there are many examples of such laws. For example, the UK enacted such a law in the wake of the HIPC initiative. So it does work. It can be constrained to a limited set of countries. It can be time limited. And so if there's a political will to protect countries in a debt crisis from legal attacks, from disruptive litigation, from free riding, then there's this possibility of changing local domestic laws, right? That's kind of like the case-by-case SDRM, if you want. And I mean, again, keep in mind that for every corporation that goes bust, they have that kind of legal protection. There is no such thing as disruptive litigation when a firm goes bust, and we can recreate that kind of framework in a piecemeal approach. I think UN resolution would be desirable, but again, with Russia and China being veto players, it's going to be hard, and even with the US, it's unclear. But that's an interesting model, I think. And the second part of my answer is basically, so I think with the creditor landscape becoming more complicated, we have to think about new, at least ad hoc or conventions, right? We have to think about a new way how debt crisis resolution usually should take place. So it's hard to enforce these things, but maybe you could think about kind of a framework in which there's a standard of principles that are applied, and there have been efforts to go in that direction, where you say creditors should participate in equal form. They should all bear the same haircut. But for that, of course, debt transparency is key. You have to know what debt each country owes to each of the creditors, to China, to the privates, and that's not given at the moment. So transparency is I think the third part of my answer. So I think we should make a bigger effort to think a big picture kind of at least proposals that are, for example, adopted by the G20. Again, enforcement might not be there, but kind of a political signal that we are thinking about fair burden sharing systematically, and debt crisis should ideally be approached in this way, that debt restructurings happen to all creditors on equal footing, without having a proper legal mechanism. Okay, so I think there's small steps that could be taken now that the crisis is looming. It could be taken quite quickly if there's political will.
Just before we move on to Ugo, do you see much appetite for this country by country approach, for example, within Europe?
I mean, one concern is that governments of Europe have so much things on their plate at the moment that maybe there's appetite, but with the tension and time limited for crisis management, there's a risk that this just falls off the agenda all the time. But I think it's, the individual countries, I think the EU would be a great place to start, right? To have kind of a joint EU initiatives on that. And I do see some appetite in some countries, but I can't look into many others. But I think there is an understanding that the current situation is not acceptable, or is not favorable with basically all this ad hoc and chaos about who's repaid and who's not.
Yeah, thank you, Ugo. Your opinion?
I tend to agree with whatever Christoph said. Maybe if I can add something more. I mean, especially on the thing that SDRM is desirable, but it's not coming anytime soon. And one thing that Christoph said, and I might add a little bit about it, that in theory, one could do a lot with local legislation, because after all, most of this debt is then litigated either in London or in New York. So with changes, in English law and in New York law, one could do a lot. And this is a little bit what we discuss in this little paper with Patrick Bolton and Mitu Gulati, this legal air cover, how one could act on domestic legislation to facilitate restructuring if a disaster were to happen.
Okay, great. Yeah, Jan, I didn't mean to ignore you. Do you want to add something to that?
Well, I have to put two questions in the chat, so I'm standing with everybody else on the question side because I'm not a speaker. So
I didn't want to. I wanted to make sure that you didn't feel that I was passing.
No, absolutely not. No. I'm just put up my questions and see.
Good. Now, also getting some attention is the question from Pavel here saying, should a distinction be made between foreign and local currency debt? And what role does local currency debt play in the restructurings? Who would like to take that one first? Christoph, you take it first.
So yes, I mean, in many of the countries we're talking about that Ugo was showing of a high risk of debt distress, those are countries that don't have developed domestic markets. Some do, but most do not. Meaning that we're still kind of in the 1980s world of external debt being the central part, and oftentimes debt owed to governments being a central part, and the IMF and the World Bank. But I think globally it's very important to keep domestic debt in mind. I think what I said about kind of the fair principles of debt restructuring that all creditors should take part, that also includes domestics, right? That also includes the domestic. Now that, of course, in a highly financialized economy like the Eurozone, that becomes tricky because you get the sovereign bank doom loop, right? You impose a haircut and then the banks go under and then you have to save the banks, etc. So, and that might even apply to Brazil, etc. So yes, we have to consider the domestic debt. In fact, Ugo has contributed to original sin literature, right, saying that the domestic debt markets are heavily underdeveloped. I think we have seen a shift in the last 10 or 20 years that in more countries now rely on domestic debt. In fact, I was expecting the next big debt crisis to be a domestic debt crisis with current, interest rates and liquidity conditions globally. This didn't happen, and we're still in this external debt world. But thinking about better ways of domestic restructurings and how it relates to the international way of doing this is indeed an important issue that I think is receiving too little attention.
Ugo, for you.
So it's true, domestic debt has become more important, and in case of default, one has to think jointly about the two things, the domestic and external debt component. One thing that differentiates them is that usually dollar debt is debt issued under foreign legislation. So it's usually issued either under English law or under New York law. So whatever things will be adjudicated by a court which sits outside the country. Most of domestic currency debt is debt issued under domestic legislation. So it will be a national court which will adjudicate any claim to it. And so in the mechanism, and you can think that a court in Argentina adjudicating on a claim on the Argentinian government might have incentives which are different from a New York court or a court in London. So that's, I guess, one of the key issues. And plus, on domestic currency debt, you have other mechanisms to dilute it, which is through inflation, and which is clearly it's not available for foreign currency debt.
Yeah, let me maybe
yes, go ahead.
Just follow up on that. Indeed, I mean, domestic history tells that domestic debt crises are often easier to solve due to the reasons Ugo has given. But there's kind of the sweet point. At some point, if you get too much domestic debt, you get into the doom loop. So you have kind of this, I do whatever I want because I have the legal power of parliament and I can cram into, the terms into my domestic banks who are under my control. But then at some point you get too much domestic debt and then it gets into this doom loop spiral. So there's kind of, I think, again, we haven't thought enough about this topic. But indeed, thanks so much for pointing out this legal part, which I should have said.
You're working as a team. Sylvia's got a two-part question on this one. It's a broad question. The consequences of high sovereign debt on future prospects for developing, also advanced countries. I guess future development growth prospects from the high sovereign debt that is going to be inevitable, and the distributional implications of default as well. If you could say something about that. Ugo, do you want to go first this time?
So the first part of the question, it's very hard, right? So it goes, if I understand the question correctly, on the literature on debt and growth, which you know, we know that there is this negative correlation that if you have high debt, you have lower growth, but the causality issue has never been fully solved. And I guess my reading of these things that, you know, each country has its own different threshold at which that starts being bad for you. So that's an amazing question for which I don't have a good answer.
It's a question for which would take an entire seminar. Yes.
Yeah. Well, I probably wouldn't have an answer after that either.
Yeah.
And the second question is also very good, because, you know, when you think about the traditional model of sovereign debt, you say, what's the distribution implication? A sovereign default redistributed resources from foreign bondholders to domestics. But then, you know, this default usually come with financial crisis. Crises are regressive, and then, you know, so there isn't much research on this, but all what I've seen, all the research I've seen, is that financial crises tend to increase income inequality, and if defaults are associated with a financial crisis, so then the redistributional effects tend to be negative.
Christoph.
Yeah, two pretty big questions indeed. So I mean, one thing I had just had a class with my students the last week talking about. I mean, we're kind of, with these low interest rates, negative interest rates, as Uwe has shown, we are kind of forced to think anew how we digest that sustainability. So we've been used to look at debt to GDP, but if Japan with 250% debt to GDP pays zero interest payments, right? Because they had 15 years of zero interest rates. Then of course, you know, that sustainability, you know, it just doesn't work anymore in our old intellectual framework, if you want. And that's why sometimes, you know, many of my colleagues jump into this likelihood, well, what happens if interest rates go back to normal, right? Because then we kind of have an intellectual edifice with which to work. Now with this very low rates, the key point indeed, and that's that it's no surprise that the discussion has turned away from debt to GDP to R minus G, because that is the key point of that sustainability analysis, the key issue. And once R minus G becomes the key term, then of course growth is likely to not move as much. I mean, sure, the growth is not the exciting part. The big question is what happens to R, right? And there, of course, it's very hard to say, right? We can't really judge upon that. But the whole discussion, and then at the end, whether this is too much and whether this is sustainable or not, at the end boils down to the question: what is the interest rate going to be in 5 or 10 years, right? And that's, of course, you know, the right interest rate is the one we observe at the moment. That's the most likely, you know, future rate as well. But yeah. So and on inequality, I mean, what I find appalling is that, or what I find impressive is Ugo showed a quote from the Egyptian president. And you know, I've been working on these archives, and you know, this kind of quotes you could see again and again and again in debt crisis in the 1980s and 1990s. It's always the same distribution question: do you spend your money on social services, education, health, etc., or do you repay the creditors? So distributional questions are really at the core. The problem is that the budgetary data, the fiscal data, is so bad. Ugo was saying that there is no research on this, but I think you know, you out there, some PhD students might be listening. I think there's a huge possibility to dig into detailed micro data. What actually happens in these kind of default situations? What payments are cut off and what payments are continued? What are the actual transfers that are happening? I think, you know, having micro data on fiscal expenditures, it's actually stunning how little micro data we have on that. generally on other questions as well. But I think to go to this distributional question, we would need to use all the beautiful tools that we have, but we need first the data. So I think there's also governments are also asked not just to release data on debt, but also on their revenues and expenditures. It's stunning how little we know about this in the details.
And if you do dig into that, you don't have to hand in your paper until after Christmas, I would imagine. Guys, Julia's question, do you think future debt restructurings will affect multilateral lending in the near future and the international financial architecture in general? Are we going to see decreasing multilateral lending as a result of the crisis that we know is coming? Ugo?
I don't, well, there is a big discussion on whether multilateral development banks should be bailed in. Actually, I was just discussing yesterday this with somebody in policy. I don't think they should. I mean, multilateral development banks are there. They are loyal lenders that tend to lend at a relatively low interest rates, so they don't charge a default risk. So I think they should, when possible, be exempted from default. And in my view, they should actually step in and provide lending if countries are actually cut out from the capital market. So I hope there will not be a reduction in multilateral lending.
You hope, but yes, but what do you think?
So I mean, I don't know. Maybe this Christopher study. Christopher's written a paper about everything, so you might, and I haven't seen it. One thing that I know, because I did write a paper about this, that lending by multilateral development bank is not pro-cyclical. So it's not. So the multilateral development bank is not the typical banker of, described by what's the name of the author of Tom Sawyer?
Mark Twain.
Mark Twain. By Mark Twain, so the typical banker is there to lend you an umbrella when the sun is shining, and he wants it back when it starts raining. Private capital markets are a little bit like this. Multilateral development banks are more stable. I've never studied what it happened around time of defaults. Maybe Christoph did it.
Christoph? So yes, I mean, I'm rather optimistic that multilateral lending will not decrease. I mean, maybe in maybe 2-3 years, but in general, I think the overall trend over the past decades, and in fact the past 200 years, has been more multilateral lending, more official lending, and one of the reasons is that this umbrella that Ugo was saying is needed, right? Capital flows, capital markets have become so large that and they are fickle. There are these sudden stops. So all these private creditors pull out, and who steps in? Well, the multilaterals do. We show that indeed. Ugo, you should send me the link of your paper. We should cite you. I didn't know either. Officials step in when private creditors try to pull out their money from these countries. So in that sense, for risk sharing, they're doing an important job, including the transfers they give, and the world has, in that sense, become more cooperative. We have seen more and more multilateral regional. We started out with bilateral lending, which was pretty ad hoc in the 19th century. Then came, these the World Bank and the IMF, and now there are all these regional institutions as well, the ESM, the Arab Monetary Fund, here and there. All these different institutions make up now a large global financial safety net, and that has been growing and is continuing to grow. So if anything, the bailouts are only getting bigger, akin to the domestic banking sector, to the too big to fail problem. So I think we are more likely to see a continuation of that. The problem is that the taxpayers are paying more and more here, and that the privates are getting away more easily as a general trend as well, right? So I think my prediction is that maybe not the World Bank and the IMF, but some form of multilateral official lending type will definitely continue. And if you think about the rise of China and the rise of India, those are players that are much more likely, those are countries much more likely to use state-directed lending, not only domestically, but also internationally. So I think this official lending is in fact on the way up. So both multilateral and official lending in general is more rather on the rise and should in fact be studied more.
Okay, we're more or less at the end. We don't have much time left, but there is a question. Well, there's two people have asked this a similar sorts of question, so I just wanted to make sure that we have that we deal with this. Lorenzo was asking, can we discuss the idea of conditionalities on debt service moratoria for a green recovery? And Christoph, different Christoph, has said, may we expect debt to climate swaps? Which sounds interesting. Ugo, either of those?
Well, they're sort of, in a sense, the similar question. I think it would be desirable. For instance, you could think about countries which I don't know much about this, but let me give you an example. So the Amazon sits mostly in Brazil and a little bit in Colombia and I guess Venezuela. And the Amazon provides a global good because it cleans the air for the whole world. So you could think that in a world that Brazil, and at the same time, Brazil could cut trees and sell the trees, and it would damage Brazil, but it would damage also the rest of the world. So you could think that what could internalize this externality by giving transfer to countries which provide global public good in terms of climate. I don't know how the design would work, but this would be based on sound economic principles. The politics would be complicated, however.
Christoph, any opinion on this?
Yeah, I agree with Ugo that this would be desirable. The question one has to ask oneself is, of course, like, is it better to give direct transfers or to do it via kind of a debt restructuring? I can see schemes, and I can definitely, the problem with transfers is the conditionality, right? I mean, as you also mentioned in the question. So maybe you have more leverage of actually seeing some favorable change with regard to the environment and to climate if you're in the midst of the debt restructuring process, right? So maybe there's an argument to indeed have a green component in restructuring operations. But it's operationally not easy, and it's at the end the same question out there is once the crisis is resolved, does this have any teeth? Is this actually implemented? But I could see schemes in which kind of international institutions, for example, subsidize. Let's have some more haircuts on private debt, but then subsidize that from the international financial institutions with a green element, for example. That could be a scheme you can think about, right? Rather than let them get away, without that, we can combine aims. But again, there's large institutional challenges, but I mean, there's smart people out there, and one can, if there's political will to do this, this can be thought of, yes. And again, it could be that we're stuck with this kind of debt overhang for quite a while in many of these countries. So I would rather speed up the thinking on this topic rather than just taking this current situation as a given. We definitely need more reforms, and the green component is an important one.
Yes, we are over time, so I better stop asking the questions now, but there's terrific answers there, and the clock's ticking. We got to hope for the best. There's a lot of word of the hope in the last hour, but also prepare for the worst, I guess, as well. Jan, do you want to say anything to wrap us up?
Well, the one thing that I would be interested in is we didn't discuss much about the incentives that are triggered by suggesting a particular solution. So, for instance, if debt relief is being given early, restructuring much earlier than rather waiting for a decade that otherwise appears to be lost, what would that do to the lending in the future? Is there basically a reason for having this long periods of waiting and cash flow reliefs only? And that also translates to that's both for the free riding, it's for the lost decade, it's always similar things. I think that is also interesting. We know this a lot in macroeconomic modeling. We always think about what does a particular action imply for the next round of interactions. But here I'm a bit missing this in this whole discussion, that we think about why isn't it so straightforward to give debt relief to somebody if the response by the market is never fund that person again. We did debt relief once, looking backwards, so to speak, because the crisis has happened. But then the welfare effect may also be quite high. And this is the question of the counterfactual. What is the counterfactual of all these actions? And we don't really know that. But I think, as Christoph said, it's a great area for research. And I would only partner with him saying, I hope that some graduate students are here and take part of that up. So I think I'm delighted by this team and by the presentations, and I hope we have more of that in the future.
Good. Well, there's plenty that we could, if we reconstituted this in the new year or in a few months' time, there's plenty for us to talk about. If you want, if you want to come back, it's not up to me. It's not up to me to say that you have to, but if you wanted to, then there's a lot of questions that we still need to answer, aren't there? So, but thank you very much for the presentations today, for the discussion today. There are lots of, we referenced quite a lot of other work, and also Ugo referenced it specifically in his presentation. If you want to go and check that out, I've read some of it and it is fantastic, and it raises as many questions as it answers, because that's the nature of this. But that's all that really is all we have time for, and it's really all we have time for more or less this year. So thank you very much to our panelists today. Christoph, Ugo, thank you. Thank you to Jan and for everyone at SAFE for organizing this. Thank you for turning up and asking questions. It's been a pretty awful year, but it has also been a year in which there has been plenty of innovative and very interesting economic research and policy ideas, and these forums are where they really come alive. So thank you for turning up to them. Let's hope that we can have a better year in 2021, but with just as good seminars in it. So from me at the CEPR and from everyone else, goodbye.
Bye-bye.
Yeah.
Bye.